"You're not allowed in this house until you apologize." My own son slammed the door on me. The sound, a sharp, definitive crack, echoed not just in the quiet suburban street, but in the hollow spaces of my chest. The deadbolt slid home with a sickening finality, a sound I knew intimately from the other side, the side of safety and warmth. Now, it was a steel bar against my heart. I stood on the worn welcome mat, the one I'd picked out with my late husband, Robert, 20 years ago. Its cheerful home sweet home message was a cruel joke. In my arms, 2 large paper grocery bags grew heavier by the second. The edge of a cereal box dug into my ribs, and the cold sweat from a carton of milk began to seep through the thin brown paper. I had just come from the market, having painstakingly selected every item on the list. My daughter-in-law, Susan, had texted me an hour earlier. Organic Gale, almond milk, gluten-free pasta, the kind of things they insisted on, the kind of things I paid for out of my pension because their budget was tight this month. It was always tight. My son, Mark, had been waiting for me. Not to help with the groceries, but to deliver his ultimatum. His face, usually soft and familiar, had been a mask of cold fury. His eyes, the same warm brown as Robert's, were glacial. "Apologize, Mom. For what you said to Susan. For upsetting her." What had I said? I'd merely suggested that perhaps their 7-year-old, Lily, shouldn't spend 6 hours a day on her tablet. I'd said it gently, framing it as a concern for her eyesight, for her imagination. It was a grandmother's concern, born of love. But in the fragile ecosystem of my son's home, my love was often reinterpreted as judgment. Susan had burst into tears, accusing me of calling her a bad mother. Mark, ever her defender, had taken her side without question. It was a familiar dance, one where my intentions were always twisted, my words always weaponized against me. And now this. Locked out of my own home. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The house, a sturdy 2-story colonial, was in my name. Robert and I had burned the mortgage papers in a celebratory bonfire in the backyard a decade ago. After he passed, I had thought it would be a wonderful idea for Mark and his young family to move in with me. The house was too big, too quiet. I craved the noise of a family, the pitter-patter of grandchildren's feet. I saw it as a continuation of our family legacy, a way to keep Robert's memory alive within these walls. They would save on rent, I would have company. It seemed perfect. For the first year, it was. Then, slowly, subtly, the tide began to turn. My favorite armchair was moved to the basement to make room for a sleek, uncomfortable chaise lounge Susan had ordered online. My weekly bridge club meetings were deemed too disruptive for Lily's nap schedule. My opinions on everything from paint colors to politics were met with polite, dismissive smiles. I had become a tenant in my own home, a tolerated ghost who paid the bills. The milk carton was definitely leaking now, a cold, damp patch spreading against my blouse. I shifted the bags, my 68-year-old arms protesting. I could leave the groceries on the porch. I could get in my car and drive away. But where would I go? My entire life, my memories, my very identity were tied up in this house. Robert's scent still lingered in the closet we had shared. The pencil marks tracking Mark's height were still on the kitchen door frame. Every creak of the floorboards was a note in the symphony of my life. I looked at the closed door, the gleaming brass knocker shaped like a pineapple, a symbol of hospitality. I thought of the apology Mark was demanding. An apology for what? For caring? For loving his child? An apology would be a lie, a betrayal of myself. But the alternative was this. Standing on the outside, looking in. An outcast. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A chill wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree Robert had planted when Mark was born. It whispered of loneliness, of a long, cold night ahead. The lock on the door felt as if it had been placed on my own heart, and for the first time, I wondered if I still had the key. I had to choose between my dignity and my home, and I wasn't sure which one I had the strength to live without. The weight of the groceries was nothing compared to the weight of that choice. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting long, dancing shadows. I was still standing there, a statue of obsolescence on the porch of a life that was no longer my own, wondering how long they would make me wait. The light continued its slow retreat, pulling the warmth of the late afternoon with it. A deep, bruised purple now bled into the orange at the horizon. I carefully lowered the grocery bags onto the porch swing, my joints creaking in protest. The damp spot on my blouse was cold against my skin. I sank down onto the swing's cushioned seat, the gentle rocking motion doing little to soothe the tremor in my soul. The silence from inside the house was absolute. There was no television drone, no sound of Lily playing, no clatter of pots and pans that would signal the start of dinner. It was a deliberate, weaponized silence, designed to punish me, to make me feel my isolation. My humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up my neck and burned my cheeks, even as the evening air grew cooler. I felt the curious glances of neighbors. Mrs. Henderson from across the street, watering her petunias, lingered a little too long with her hose pointed in my direction. The Miller kids, riding their bikes down the sidewalk, slowed as they passed, their young faces a mixture of confusion and intrigue. I was a spectacle. The old woman locked out of her own house. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, trying to shrink, to become invisible. For 45 years, this house had been my sanctuary. It was where Robert and I had built a life, brick by brick, memory by memory. I remembered bringing a newborn Mark home from the hospital, his tiny body wrapped in a blue blanket, and carrying him over this very threshold. I remembered birthday parties in the backyard, the lawn dotted with colorful balloons and shrieking children. I remembered Christmases, the living room window fogged with condensation, the scent of pine and roasting turkey filling every room. I remembered standing in that same living room, years later, surrounded by friends and family after Robert's funeral, their quiet murmurs of condolence a soft blanket against the sharp edges of my grief. This house wasn't just wood and plaster, it was the repository of my entire existence. It held the echoes of my laughter, the stains of my tears. Now, those echoes were silenced by the cold, hard fact of a locked door. The contrast was a chasm that threatened to swallow me whole. The silence from within wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an active presence, a wall built of my son's anger and my daughter-in-law's resentment. It told me I was not wanted, not valued, not part of the family I had dedicated my life to building. The groceries sat beside me on the swing, a pathetic offering. The organic gale, which I found bitter and overpriced, suddenly seemed symbolic of all the small concessions I had made, all the ways I had contorted myself to fit into their life, their rules. I had tried to be the cool mom, the easy grandmother. I didn't smoke. I didn't drink more than a single glass of wine. I didn't offer unsolicited advice, or so I had thought. My gentle suggestion about Lily's screen time had apparently been a cardinal sin. I wondered what was happening inside. Was Susan triumphant? Was she sitting on the new chaise lounge, describing my transgression to Mark, reinforcing his decision to lock me out? Was my granddaughter, Lily, even aware that her nana was sitting on the porch in the growing darkness? Or had they told her I'd gone home? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. They were erasing me bit by bit, they were editing me out of the family portrait, and this was just the most blatant, cruelest revision yet. The weight of their silence was heavier than any shout, more painful than any insult. It was the weight of insignificance. It communicated, more clearly than any words, that my presence, my feelings, my very being, were of no consequence to them. The last sliver of sun disappeared, and the world was plunged into the grey twilight. I was alone, adrift on my own front porch. The swing swayed gently, an empty cradle rocking in the dark. The silence wasn't just in the house, it was in my heart, a vast, echoing void where a family used to be. And the deepest, most terrifying part of that silence was the question it posed: what if the door never opened again? The chill in the air seeped into my bones, a cold that had little to do with the falling temperature. It was the deep, internal freeze of disillusionment. My mind, seeking warmth, fled from the cold porch and dove into the past, searching for the kindling of happier memories. But tonight, every memory was tinged with the bitter smoke of my present reality. They weren't comforting, they were exhibits in the long, silent trial of my life, evidence of a sacrifice I hadn't even realized I was making. I saw myself at 30, working the late shift at the diner after my day job as a receptionist. Robert's salary as a high school teacher was steady, but it wasn't enough to get the down payment for this house, the house we both dreamed of. So I tied on an apron, soaked my tired feet in Epsom salts every night, and served coffee and pie to truckers until 2 in the morning. I remembered the exhaustion, so profound it was like a physical weight on my shoulders. But I also remembered the fierce joy I felt when we finally held the keys in our hands. I had done it for us, for the future family we envisioned. I'd thought of it as an investment in our shared dream. Now, it felt like I had laid the foundation for my own prison. The memory shifted. Mark was 10, and he wanted, more than anything in the world, a new Schwinn bicycle for his birthday. The expensive one with the 10-speed gears and the glittery blue frame. We couldn't afford it. Not without a sacrifice. I had a gold locket, a precious heirloom from my own grandmother. It was the one piece of real jewelry I owned. I sold it. I told Robert the first lost it, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. But the look on Mark's face when he saw that bicycle on his birthday morning, a look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy, made the lie seem worth it. I had given a piece of my past for a piece of his happiness. He'd ridden that bike until the wheels were worn and the frame was scratched, never knowing its true cost. Looking at the closed door now, I wondered if he had ever truly understood the cost of anything. I saw a montage of smaller, daily sacrifices, a tapestry woven so tightly into the fabric of my motherhood that I had ceased to see them as individual threads. Patching the knees of Mark's jeans for the 3rd time instead of buying new ones, so we could afford his school field trip. Saying I wasn't hungry at dinner so he and Robert could have second helpings. Using my vacation days from work not for rest, but to care for him when he had the chicken pox. Foregoing a new dress so he could have the brand name sneakers all the other kids were wearing. Each one was a small act of love, a willing surrender of my own needs for the sake of my family. I never kept a tally. I never expected a reward. It was simply what mothers did. After Robert died, the sacrifices changed, but they didn't stop. When Mark lost his job during the recession, I drained a significant portion of my savings to keep him afloat, to make sure Lily never felt the insecurity her parents were wrestling with. When Susan wanted to go back to school to get her master's degree, I became Lily's full-time caregiver, putting my own plans for a quiet retirement, traveling, taking a pottery class, on indefinite hold. I did it gladly. I told myself it was a gift to see my granddaughter every day. And it was. But it was also a quiet closing of doors on my own life, a life I had earned the right to live for myself. The betrayal I felt now was so sharp because it was a betrayal not just of me, the 68-year-old woman on the porch, but of the 30-year-old waitress, the grieving widow, the doting grandmother. It was a desecration of every meal I'd cooked, every tear I'd dried, every dollar I'd stretched. They hadn't just locked me out of the house, they had invalidated a lifetime of devotion. My sacrifices, it seemed, had an expiration date. They were appreciated only as long as they were useful. The moment I became an inconvenience, the moment I voiced an opinion that ran contrary to their own, the ledger was wiped clean. All that I had given was forgotten, and all that remained was my perceived transgression. The wind rustled the oak tree's leaves again, and it sounded like a sad, regretful sigh. It was the sound of my own heart, breaking for the woman I had been and for the recognition she would never receive. The sharpest pang of all was the realization that my sacrifices hadn't bought me love or security. They had bought me this, a seat on a cold porch swing, outside a locked door, with nothing but the ghosts of my own generosity to keep me company. As I sat there, replaying the reel of my life's sacrifices, a new, unsettling pattern began to emerge from the fog of my memories. It was like one of those magic eye pictures. If you stared long enough, a hidden image would suddenly leap out at you. The slammed door, the ultimatum, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was the logical conclusion of a campaign that had been waged against me for years, a slow, insidious erosion of my place in this house and in this family. The control hadn't been seized in a coup, it had been taken in 1,000 tiny, almost unnoticeable increments. It started with kindness, a mask so convincing that I had not only welcomed it, I had been grateful for it. "Oh, Mom, don't worry about the property taxes, let me handle that online for you. It's so much easier." Mark had said that 2 years ago. It had seemed like a thoughtful gesture. I hated dealing with online portals and passwords. But in retrospect, it was the first step in him taking over the household finances, the very finances I was funding. Soon, he was helping with the utility bills, the homeowner's insurance. He had all the account numbers, all the passwords. I was still paying for everything, my pension deposited directly into the joint account he had encouraged us to open for convenience, but I no longer had my hands on the reins. I had no idea where the money was truly going. Susan's methods were softer, wrapped in the guise of modernizing the house and making my life more comfortable. "That old armchair is so bad for your back, Eleanor," she'd say, using my first name in a way that felt both intimate and dismissive. "Let's get something with better lumbar support." The new chaise lounge arrived, and my beloved, worn armchair, the one Robert and I had spent countless evenings in, disappeared into the basement. My voice in decorating decisions was gently but firmly overridden. My traditional, comfortable home was slowly being transformed into a showroom from a minimalist magazine I didn't understand. It was all done with smiles and phrases like, "We just want what's best for you." My role as a grandmother was also subtly curated and controlled. At first, I was the primary caregiver. Then, Susan started to express concerns. "I read an article that says grandparents often rely on outdated disciplinary methods. We're using a positive reinforcement approach with Lily." My intuitive, time-tested ways of raising a child, the same ways that had produced her husband, were now deemed outdated. I was given articles to read, schedules to follow. My time with Lily became supervised. Spontaneous trips to the park for ice cream were replaced with pre-approved educational outings. My authority was chipped away, piece by piece, until I was little more than a state-sanctioned babysitter, one who was expected to follow a script. The ultimate tool of their control, I realized with a sickening lurch, was my love for them. They knew I craved family, that I was lonely after Robert's death. They knew I would do anything to avoid conflict, anything to keep the peace. My desire for a happy, harmonious home was the very weapon they used against me. Any pushback, any assertion of my own needs or opinions, was met with Susan's tears or Mark's pained silence. I would be made to feel guilty, as if I were the one disrupting the tranquility. I was the difficult one. I was the one who needed to be more flexible. I was the one who had to apologize to smooth things over. And I always did. I apologized for things I didn't feel were wrong, just to feel the warmth of their approval again, to be allowed back into the fold. This time was different only in its overtness. The locked door was merely a physical manifestation of all the invisible walls they had been building around me for years. They had isolated me financially, socially, and emotionally, all under the guise of caring for me. They had created a dynamic where I was completely dependent on their goodwill, and then they had withdrawn it as punishment. The kindness had been a Trojan horse, and I had foolishly opened the gates and welcomed it in. Now, the soldiers were pouring out, and they had taken my city. I wasn't just locked out of a building, I was locked out of a life I thought was my own, and the most chilling realization of all was that I had handed them the key myself, long ago. A pair of headlights swept across the lawn, momentarily blinding me. A car pulled into the driveway next door. Doors opened and closed. A few moments later, a figure emerged from the darkness and walked toward me. It was my neighbor, Beth. She was a widow, like me, a retired nurse with a gentle demeanor and eyes that saw more than most. We had a friendly, over the fence relationship, mostly exchanging pleasantries about the weather and our gardens. Eleanor? Her voice was soft, laced with concern. I saw your car. I thought you were inside. Is everything all right, dear? The simple, kind question was my undoing. All evening, I had been battling my own swirling thoughts, my shame, my anger, my grief. I had been trying to maintain a veneer of composure for the prying eyes of the neighborhood. But Beth's genuine concern pierced through my carefully constructed defenses. A lump formed in my throat, thick and painful. I tried to speak, to offer a plausible excuse. Maybe I'd lost my key. Maybe I was just enjoying the evening air. But the lies wouldn't come. My throat was too tight, my heart too heavy. I shook my head, a small, jerky movement. I couldn't meet her eyes. I stared at my own hands, twisted together in my lap, the knuckles white. Beth didn't press. She simply came up the porch steps and sat beside me on the swing. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just sat with me in the darkness, a quiet, comforting presence. The silence between us was different from the hostile silence emanating from the house. This was a shared silence, an understanding one. Finally, she spoke again, her voice even gentler than before. Do you want to talk about it? The dam broke. The words came out in a ragged whisper, a confession I hadn't even allowed myself to fully form in my own mind. They locked me out. I said it. I said the shameful, unbelievable words aloud. And the world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. Hearing the sentence hang in the cool night air between us gave it a terrible reality. It was no longer just a feeling, a fear, a humiliation trapped inside my head. It was a fact. My son, I continued, my voice cracking. He and his wife. They told me I couldn't come in until I apologized. Apologized for what? Beth asked, her tone devoid of judgment. I told her about the comment regarding Lily's tablet, about Susan's tears, about the years of small surrenders that had led to this moment. The story tumbled out of me, disjointed and emotional. I wasn't making excuses or seeking pity. I was simply bearing witness to my own truth for the first time. I was telling someone what had happened to me, and in the telling, I was finally hearing it for myself. Beth listened patiently. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She just listened. When I finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling, she placed a warm, dry hand over my own trembling ones. Her touch was firm and grounding. Oh, Eleanor, she said, and her voice was full of a deep, resonant empathy. That's not right. That's not right at all. And then, she gave me the gift I didn't know I needed. She became my mirror. You know, she said, her gaze steady and clear, from my kitchen window, I see you. I see you taking out their trash. I see you mowing this big lawn all by yourself. I see the grocery delivery trucks coming twice a week, and I know it's not you eating all that fancy food. I see a good woman being taken for granted. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in my eyes and streamed down my face. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of recognition. Someone else saw it. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being overly sensitive. What was happening was real, and it was wrong. Hearing my reality validated by another person, by a kind neighbor who had no stake in the family drama, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. I finally managed to speak the truth, the whole, unvarnished truth, not just about the locked door, but about my place in this world they had created. They don't want me here, I whispered, the admission a release of a pressure I hadn't known I was holding. It was a surrender, but not a defeat. It was the first step toward seeing the bars of my cage. Beth squeezed my hand. Well, she said softly, but with a surprising strength in her voice, the question is, my dear, do you still want to be here? The question hung in the air, a terrifying and exhilarating possibility. Beth's question echoed in the cavern of my newly emptied heart. Do you still want to be here? It wasn't a question I had ever allowed myself to ask. My presence in this house, in this family, had felt as fundamental as the ground beneath my feet. It was a given, an unchangeable fact of my existence. But now, sitting on the outside, I could see it for what it was, a choice. A choice I had been making every day, unconsciously, to accept the unacceptable. After Beth went home, promising to check on me and leaving me with a thermos of hot tea, I remained on the swing. The tea warmed my hands, a small comfort against the encroaching night. Her words had planted a seed in the barren soil of my despair, and now, in the quiet solitude, it began to sprout. I see a good woman being taken for granted. For so long, I had seen myself through their eyes, a burden, a nuisance, an outdated relic who should be grateful for a place to stay. I had internalized their narrative so completely that I had forgotten my own. I was not a guest in this house. I was the owner. I was not a charity case. My pension, the money Robert and I had so carefully saved, paid for the roof over their heads, the food in their bellies, the electricity that powered their countless devices. I had been operating under the delusion that we were a family, sharing a home. But we weren't. It was a business transaction, and I was the silent, ever-giving partner who was now being unceremoniously fired for a minor infraction. A quiet fire began to kindle in my chest. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of a shouting match. It was a slow, steady burn of pure, unadulterated clarity. The humiliation that had scorched my cheeks for hours began to cool, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Why was I the one sitting out here in the dark? Why was I the one expected to grovel and apologize for a manufactured offense? If I was not welcome in the house I owned, then perhaps it wasn't me who should feel ashamed. Perhaps the shame belonged to the people inside, the ones who would lock out their own mother, their benefactor, over a perceived slight. I reached into my purse, my fingers fumbling past old lipstick tubes and crumpled receipts until they closed around my key ring. I pulled it out. The collection of brass keys gleamed dully in the faint moonlight. There was the key to the front door, the back door, the garage, the little key to the mailbox. For decades, these keys had represented security, belonging, home. They were the tangible proof of a life well lived, a foundation well built. But as I stared at them in my palm, their meaning shifted. They were no longer symbols of security, they were symbols of my servitude. They were the keys to a cage I had helped build and then willingly inhabited. The front door key, in particular, seemed to mock me. What good was a key when the deadbolt was thrown against you? What good was ownership when you had no power? These keys didn't represent my access, they represented everything I stood to lose if I didn't comply, if I didn't play by their rules. They were a chain, and the house was the anchor, holding me in place while my life drifted away. I closed my hand around the keys, the metal edges digging into my palm. The small pain was grounding. It was real. In that moment, something inside me shifted, a tectonic plate of my soul grinding into a new position. The years of quiet acquiescence, of prioritizing their comfort over my own dignity, fell away. The desire to keep the peace at any cost evaporated, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar desire to protect myself. I was done waiting. I was done hoping the door would open. I was done believing that if I was just a little quieter, a little more accommodating, a little less me, they would finally love and respect me. Respect wasn't something you earned through self-erasure. It was something you demanded by refusing to be erased. I looked up at the dark windows of the house. My house. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my marrow, that I would not be spending the night on this porch. I would not be begging for entry. The rules of the game had just changed. I was no longer a pawn. I was the one who was about to flip the entire board. The brass keys in my hands suddenly felt different. They weren't a chain anymore. They were a weapon, and I finally knew how to use them. The fire inside me, once a flicker, was now a contained but powerful blaze. The indecision and grief that had paralyzed me were burned away, leaving behind the hard, clear residue of purpose. I stood up from the swing, my movements no longer tired and defeated, but deliberate and energized. I walked down the porch steps and onto the cool grass of the lawn, putting a physical distance between myself and the house. I needed to breathe air that wasn't saturated with the memory of my own submission. From my purse, I retrieved my cell phone. My hands were trembling, not from fear or weakness, but from a surge of adrenaline, the likes of which I hadn't felt in years. It was the electrifying thrill of defiance. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb swiping past Mark without a flicker of hesitation. I went straight to our realtor. Her name was Charlotte Payne. She had helped a friend from my old bridge club sell her condo last year. My friend had described her as a shark in a sensible blazer. Right now, a shark was exactly what I needed. I pressed the call button before I could second-guess myself. It was late, well past business hours, but I was counting on the relentless hustle of a successful real estate agent. It rang 3 times, and I held my breath. "This is Charlotte," a brisk, professional voice answered. My own voice, when I spoke, was surprisingly steady. All the quivering emotion had been distilled into a calm, resolute tone. "Charlotte, my name is Eleanor Ainsworth. You don't know me, but you were recommended by a mutual friend, Patricia Gable." "Of course, Patricia. A lovely lady. How is she?" Charlotte's voice was warm but efficient. "What can I do for you this evening, Eleanor?" I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. This was it. The point of no return. "I want to sell my house," I said. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting, "all business now. Are you just starting to consider the market, or—" "No," I cut her off, my voice sharp with urgency. "I want to list it. Tomorrow. Today, if possible. I want to sell it as quickly as you can." Another pause, this one longer. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, sensing the unusual circumstances, the commission. "Eleanor, that's a big decision to make so suddenly. Are you sure you wouldn't like to sleep on it? Maybe we could meet in my office tomorrow and discuss a strategy." "I am standing on the front lawn of the house right now," I said, my voice low and intense. "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I have the deed. The title is clean. It's in my name, and my name alone. I want a for sale sign in this yard by sunrise. I want the listing to go live on the internet by noon. I am prepared to be aggressive on the price. I don't want a bidding war. I want a quick, clean sale." The sheer force of my conviction must have transmitted itself through the phone. Charlotte's professional skepticism melted away, replaced by an audible excitement. This wasn't just a sale, it was a story. And a motivated seller was a realtor's dream. "I understand," she said, her voice now humming with energy. "Eleanor, I can be there in 20 minutes with the paperwork. We can do a preliminary signing tonight, and I can have my photographer here first thing in the morning." "I'll be waiting," I said, and ended the call. The act felt radical, dangerous, almost insane. I had just set in motion the dismantling of my entire life. The foundation I had so carefully built was about to be sold to the highest bidder. A wave of panic threatened to crest, but I pushed it down, focusing instead on the intoxicating feeling that was blooming in its place: freedom. It was the first breath I had taken in years that wasn't filtered through the needs and expectations of others. It was sharp, cold, and utterly exhilarating. I looked back at the house, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It looked beautiful and imposing. For so long, I had seen it as my fortress. Now I saw it for what it had become, a gilded cage. And I had just hired someone to come and blow the door clean off its hinges. In 20 minutes, a shark in a sensible blazer would arrive, and the life I had known would officially be over. For the first time all night, I smiled. Charlotte arrived in a sleek black sedan exactly 19 minutes later. She was everything Patricia had described: sharp, impeccably dressed, with a briefcase that seemed to contain the answer to every possible problem. She didn't ask questions about my situation, her professional gaze taking in my disheveled appearance and the dark house behind me with a discreet, unreadable expression. She simply spread the listing agreement across the hood of her car, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the fine print. I signed my name, Eleanor Ainsworth, on every dotted line. The stroke of the pen felt like a seismic event, a declaration of independence written in blue ink. The next morning, I woke stiffly in my car, which I had parked down the street. I had refused Beth's offer of her spare room, needing this strange, liminal state of homelessness to fuel my resolve. As the sun began to rise, just as promised, a man arrived and hammered a sign into my front lawn. The bold red and white of Charlotte's Realty Company was a splash of violent color against the manicured green. For sale. The words were a shout in the quiet morning. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. Around 8:30 a.m., my phone, which I had put on silent, began to vibrate incessantly. A string of texts from Mark. Mom, what is this? Call me right now. Is this a joke? Susan is having a panic attack. Pick up the phone. Then, the call came. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. This time, I answered, but I didn't speak. I just listened. Mom? Mom, what the hell is going on? Mark's voice was a frantic mixture of outrage and disbelief. There's a for sale sign in our yard. Charlotte Payne just called me and said she needs to schedule a photographer. What did you do? I let the silence stretch, a tactic I had learned from him. Let the other person rush to fill the void. This isn't funny, Mom, he said, his voice rising in panic. You can't do this. We live here. This is our home. Finally, I found my voice. It was calm, detached, the voice of a woman he didn't know. No, Mark, I said evenly. It is my home. And I have decided to sell it. What? Why? Over a stupid argument? You're going to make your family homeless over a stupid argument? He yelled, his voice cracking. How could you be so selfish? So vindictive? The accusations, which would have shattered me just 24 hours earlier, now glanced off me like pebbles off steel. The words selfish and vindictive were so absurd, so completely contrary to the truth of my entire life, that they had no power. I'm not being vindictive, Mark, I replied, my voice still unnervingly calm. I am making a practical decision. You and Susan have made it clear that my presence in my own home is conditional upon my absolute compliance with your wishes. You have demonstrated that you are willing to lock me out and leave me on the porch overnight if I fail to meet those conditions. That is not a tenable living situation for me. So you kick us out? With a child? Where are we supposed to go? The outrage in his voice was now laced with a thread of genuine fear. I could hear Susan sobbing hysterically in the background. The sound didn't move me. This was the moment of truth. The confrontation I had avoided my entire life. For years, I had been the one begging to be let inside, emotionally if not physically. I had contorted myself, apologized, and surrendered pieces of my soul just to be allowed back into the warm circle of their acceptance. Now, the roles were reversed. I held all the keys, all the power, and beneath his blustering anger, I could hear what was really there, the terrified pleading of a man who had suddenly realized his comfortable, subsidized life was about to end. The control he had so carefully cultivated had been a house of cards, and I had just pulled out the foundation. That, I said, and the words felt like liberation, is for you and your wife to figure out. You are both adults. You have been living rent-free in a home I own and pay for. I believe the term for what I am doing is reclaiming my assets. Reclaiming your assets? You're talking about your family like it's a business deal. He sputtered. You're the ones who turned it into a business deal, Mark, I said, and my voice was cold now, a reflection of the night I had spent on that porch. You set the terms and conditions. I simply refused to accept them any longer. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. He had no response. He had expected me to grumble, to apologize, to beg him to let me take down the sign. He had never, in his wildest dreams, imagined this. He had never imagined me without him. The house goes on the market today, I said, delivering the final blow. Charlotte will be in touch about showings. I suggest you cooperate. A fast sale is in everyone's best interest. Before he could respond, before he could launch into another tirade of accusations or pleas, I ended the call. I sat in my car, the phone in my hand, and for the first time, I felt the shift in the Earth's gravity. I was no longer a satellite orbiting his sun. I was my own planet, and for once, He was the one being pulled by my tide. The fear I saw in him was a mirror of the fear I had lived with for years. And it was a strangely, profoundly satisfying sight. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and a strange, hollow sort of freedom. The process of selling the house, which I had imagined would be a gut-wrenching ordeal of parting with my memories, was surprisingly clinical. Charlotte, my shark in a sensible blazer, handled everything. She staged the house with impersonal furniture, erasing the last traces of both my life with Robert and Mark's subsequent takeover. When I saw the online photos, it was like looking at the home of a stranger. It was just a property, a collection of rooms, a valuable asset in a hot market. The emotional chains that had bound me to it were already rusting away. Mark and Susan were forced into a humiliating retreat. They were civil during the showings, their resentment a simmering volcano beneath a thin crust of courtesy. They had no choice. Charlotte had made it clear that any attempt to sabotage the sale would result in legal action. They packed their belongings in a flurry of angry, resentful energy. I did not go to the house to help, nor did I go to supervise. I stayed away, communicating only through Charlotte or text messages. I was severing the limb, and I knew it had to be a clean, quick cut. There were moments of sadness, of course. Sorting through the boxes I had stored in the attic, I came across Robert's old sweaters, still smelling faintly of his cologne. I found photo albums filled with pictures of a smiling, happy Mark, a little boy who held my hand and believed I was the center of his universe. A wave of grief for the family I thought I had, the family I had lost, washed over me. I allowed myself to feel it, to cry the tears I hadn't shed on the porch. But this grief was different. It was a cleansing grief, a letting go, not a desperate plea for things to be different. I was mourning a past that was well and truly over, not trying to resurrect it. The house sold in 6 days. A young family from out of state paid over the asking price, no inspection. The closing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. It was all happening so fast it felt unreal. The day I signed the final papers was overcast and gray. I sat in a sterile title company office, a stack of documents in front of me. As I signed my name over and over, transferring ownership of the house that had been the entire landscape of my adult life, I felt not a sense of loss, but a sense of profound lightness. With each signature, I was unburdening myself. I was shedding the weight of unspoken expectations, the heavy cloak of their disapproval, the crushing responsibility for their happiness. After the signing, I didn't drive past the house for one last look. I drove straight to a small, waterfront real estate office in a coastal town 2 hours away, a place I had always dreamed of retiring to. It was a town where the air smelled of salt and freedom. I had seen a listing online for a small cottage, perched on a bluff overlooking the sea. It was tiny, only 2 bedrooms, with a wide, weathered porch and windows that faced the sunrise. It was the antithesis of the grand, empty colonial I had just sold. I walked through it that afternoon with a local agent. It was perfect. It was quiet. It was all mine. I made an offer on the spot, a cash offer from the proceeds of my sale. It was accepted by evening. The move was simple. I didn't have much to take. Most of my belongings had been relegated to the attic and basement of the old house years ago. I took my books, my photo albums, Robert's favorite reading chair, and the contents of my sewing room. Everything else, the lifetime of accumulated objects, I let go of. My first night in the cottage, I didn't bother unpacking. I carried a box of kitchen essentials inside, made myself a cup of tea, and walked out onto the porch. The sun was setting over the ocean, a spectacular display of fiery color that mirrored the turmoil and triumph of the past few weeks. A gentle sea breeze whispered through the dune grass. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore below. It was a sound of immense and ancient peace. For so long, solitude had been my enemy. It was the quiet in the house after Robert died, the loneliness that had made me so desperate for Mark and his family to move in. I had run from it, tried to fill it with their noise, their lives, their needs. Now, sitting on this porch, I embraced it. This wasn't the silence of exile, it was the sacred quiet of a sanctuary. It was the sound of my own life, waiting to be listened to. The house, my house, was no longer a weapon they could use against me. It was the key that had unlocked my cage. I had chosen myself. And in the quiet hum of the ocean, I felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly at home. The mornings in my little cottage by the sea began with light. Not the harsh, insistent alarm clock I used to set to get Lily ready for school, but a soft, pearly gray light that would creep over the ocean's horizon and spill through my bedroom window. I'd lie in bed for a few moments, watching the colors shift from pale lavender to a vibrant, hopeful pink. There was no one to rush for, no schedule to adhere to but my own. The only demand on my time was the tide's gentle invitation for a morning walk. I started collecting sea glass. Each morning, I'd walk along the shore, my bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand, and I'd search for the smooth, tumbled-down remnants of broken things made beautiful by the relentless churn of the ocean. I had a growing collection of greens, browns, and the occasional rare cobalt blue sitting in a large glass jar on my windowsill. They were a metaphor, I supposed. A reminder that even things that have been shattered can be worn into something new and lovely, something with soft edges and a quiet glow. I bought a loom, a beautiful floor loom made of aged maple wood, and set it up in the spare bedroom overlooking the water. I had always wanted to learn to weave. In my old life, it was one of those someday dreams, perpetually pushed aside by the more immediate needs of my family. Now, someday was here. I spent hours at the loom, the rhythmic clatter of the shuttle and the gentle thumping of the beater creating a meditative rhythm. I wove with colors inspired by the sea and the sky, blues, grays, sandy beiges, and the fiery oranges of the sunset. I wasn't weaving for anyone else, not for a craft fair or for profit. I was weaving for the simple joy of creating, of pulling threads together to make a whole cloth, a tangible result of my own time and effort. My neighbor here is a man named Arthur, a retired fisherman with hands like old leather and a quiet, gentle smile. He lives 2 cottages down. He doesn't see me as a woman being taken for granted. He sees me as Eleanor. He saw me struggling with a stubborn patch of weeds in my new garden one afternoon and came over with a pitchfork and a bucket. We worked side by side in comfortable silence for an hour before he invited me over to his porch for a glass of iced tea. Our conversations are easy. We talk about the weather, the best places to find clams, the books we're reading. He tells me stories of his life at sea, of storms and seasons. I tell him about Robert, about my love for gardening. I have never once spoken to him about Mark or Susan or the house I left behind. My past is my own, it does not define my present. With Arthur, and with the few other friends I've made in the small community, the librarian, the woman who runs the local bakery, I am not a mother or a grandmother first. I am a person. A contemporary. An equal. It is a revelation. One afternoon, a package arrived. It was a thick manila envelope with no return address, but I recognized Mark's handwriting. My heart gave a single, hard thud, an involuntary echo of the old anxiety. I left it on the kitchen counter for a full day before I opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long. It was full of accusations, blame, and self-pity. He wrote about how difficult their lives were now, how they were struggling to find an apartment they could afford, how I had traumatized Lily by abandoning them. Tucked inside the letter was a single photograph of Lily, smiling for the camera. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost pathetic. There was not a single word of apology. Not a hint of remorse or self-reflection. He still believed he was the victim. I read the letter once, then I walked out to the small fire pit in my backyard. I crumpled the pages, along with the photograph, and I set them on fire. I watched the edges curl and blacken, the angry words turning to smoke and ash, carried away on the salty wind until they were nothing. I felt no anger, no sadness. Just a profound sense of peace. The apology I had once craved, the one he had demanded of me on the porch, was a currency I no longer dealt in. His validation was worthless because I had finally learned how to validate myself. I no longer live for apologies that will never come. I live for the sunrise over the water, for the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, for the quiet click-clack of my loom, for the easy companionship of a friend who asks for nothing more than my presence. I live for the woman who found the strength to turn the key, not to open a door that was closed to her, but to lock it behind her and walk away. Sometimes, freedom isn't what lies on the other side of the door. Sometimes, it begins the moment you stop waiting for it to open, and you build a new house, a smaller, quieter house, with a much, much better view.